Welcome everyone to another FOIA Friday. As we approach Sunshine Week next week, we're having a special FOIA Friday on a Thursday and not at 1 p.m. but at noon. And this is a special conversation because it's a question that we've gotten often over the last year or so, which is how has FOIA changed in this administration? What do requesters do about it? How do you orient yourself to what seems to be a whole new world in public records, especially at the federal level, as FOIA departments are changed and slimmed down into skeleton crews as cultural changes happen in this administration? And I've got a really, really great guest to explain this all to us, Nick Santos. Nick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Dylan. My name is Nick Santos. I am a customer client support specialist here with Muckrock. I have been a FOIA officer, FOIA analyst, whatever you want to call it, for the past 5 years, specifically within the Department of Homeland Security at both the Federal Emergency Management Agency and also the United States Coast Guard, with some work in coordination with the DHS Privacy Office as well.
Awesome. So you can see why Nick is the right person to answer some of these questions. He's our man behind the scenes, not just a reporter or a Muck Rock employee, but someone who's been on the other side of all the requests. And I'm imagining this just as a conversation between Nick and I over the next 30 or so minutes, where I ask him some of the questions that people have been asking me over the last year. But if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. I'm going to try to keep the chat open as well as the question queue for the webinar format. So really just pop questions in as they come up. I'll try to keep track of them. I have a lot of questions for Nick, but I also hope to wrap them up in about 30 to 40 minutes because I know you all will have more questions to get into and want to talk with Nick directly. So again, keep those questions for the end if you want a longer answer, but if you want us to tackle them as they come up, I'll be keeping an eye on that. So, Nick, my first question to start off is this audience is hearing your voice and probably thinking the same thing that I thought when I first heard your voice, which is why did you not become a radio host? You have a very smooth radio voice. How did you end up becoming a FOIA analyst?
Well, to answer the first question, I am fundamentally a coward. I'm kidding now. I didn't do, I've been told that I have a good voice. I just had other things that I wanted to do. But yeah, to give you some background on like what led me to becoming a FOIA analyst and getting interested in the FOIA, I went to VCU in 2018. So I graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2018, and I was very interested in a lot of like different types of like like social theory, yada yada yada. I being that, right, a nerd for, like just current events and things like that, I was really into John Oliver and his show. And they did a entire episode about FOIA, and that kind of like put it in my mind for a while. Obviously I tucked it back there for a minute, graduated 2018. I worked at a law firm as a patent paralegal in Leesburg, Virginia. And then the pandemic came around, and there was a posting for FOIA analyst position at Federal Emergency Management Agency, since they were the responding agency to the pandemic. So I saw that. I thought to myself, hey, I know generally what this thing is. I might as well just put my hat in the ring, right? I want to help out, the country, whatever I can do. And they accepted my application. That's how I got in. Yeah, it's kind of the journey that took me in there. And then once I got in, I just fell in love, man. Like I really did. I feel like a lot of people, I've been a lot of analysts that really take, the mission of the FOIA very seriously. And I was very, very lucky to be sort of like surrounded by those types of analysts at FEMA. That group is such an amazing group of people. I learned so many things. It was like a FOIA boot camp. We were all like at home. We all just had FOIA requests. You know what I mean? We were all like, up until or online for like a little too long than we should have. But yeah, I was just like immersed in it. And especially like in a really like high intense energy environment with the pandemic going on and us being the responding agency. It was just like yeah, I just loved it. It was like accelerating to like a million like miles per hour. But it was good. Yeah.
And so that first job was at FEMA, the
Yeah,
first FOIA job that you had?
was that FEMA?
And what was like first day in the office like? Do you have requests
Oh,
coming in? Do you they go over the law with you? Like
yeah,
what's the
yeah.
training look like?
Yeah, so actually it was really cool. A lot of times when it comes to FOIA training, people don't it's very here it's in a way it's heuristic, right? What I mean by that is to say that, people, the people that are training you, right? They understand that the FOIA and the types of like FOIA requests that you're going to get are just like they could be all over the place, right? Not no one FOIA request tends to be the same as another one. So really what you do is that you kind of like get taken under like someone's wing who's like really knows what they're doing. At first, you'll meet your manager. They'll like tell you like, hey, all the HR stuff, how to figure that out, federal employment. And then after that, they'll say, for me, I had the very, very good luck, and I'll mention my name. Her name is Brooke Nichols. She was my first direct report at FEMA, and she was just a rock star. I mean, like she knew everything there was to know about the FOIA, and I was just like, clinging on to like every word that she had. So she really, what it looked like was that, for the first like few weeks, you get acclimated with like an expert, right? It's kind of like I would imagine like it's like kind of like being in my father-in-law is a doctor, so I'd imagine it's a little bit similar to being like what is it, like an attending, right? And then you
Mm-hmm.
have like a resident like doctor that's like, actually like responsible and showing around like the people who are like newer. And that's pretty much what it was for quite some time until, you sort of get your like, your shaky sea legs start to like get a little like, stiffer and you're able to like, work with it a little bit more. And then, after like about a month and some change, maybe like less time, I can't remember exactly now, it's been like 5 years. Yeah, you get your own set of cases. You start off small, like maybe like a portfolio of like five for like the week, right? And see like what's going on. Eventually you start getting like more of them. Eventually you start like getting like days where you're monitoring like the FOIA inboxes, whatever that looks like, how we do intake and stuff. Usually you start off with doing intake, right? And then later on you start doing processing. The more experience you have, doing good, right? And yeah, that's kind of how it goes. After that, you could go into like appeals and all kinds of stuff. So yeah.
In that time when you're the attending, working with your mentor, that person is kind of bringing you FOIA requests, or you're seeing the FOIA requests that she's responding to, and you're thinking through not only how she's responding to what is being asked for and how it fits in the world of FOIA exemptions, but also trying to find your subject matter experts, seeing
Yeah.
who she goes to for what. And then I guess that means you have to know the whole structure of FEMA pretty well because
Yeah.
you have to know how to find your subject matter experts.
Right. Exactly. And actually one thing you learn like some people learn it quickly, some people it takes a little bit more time. But you start to get really good at taking a bit of information that has like no context to it, and being able to place like, oh, I know exactly where that's done, right? And
Mm,
that's like the path you want to like be on, at least like when you're first starting as like an intake specialist, like I was. So what'll happen is that like you'll go over your like first like set of like I don't know like 5 to 10 requests with your mentor, right? They'll be like, hey, and she did it like a fantastic job. I actually ended up doing it like the same way that she did when I started becoming like a manager later on at Coast Guard. What she did was that, she just started off saying, hey, I have these 10 requests that came in today. I'm going to literally talk my thought process through of how I'm going to go through all of them. And the last two, I want you to be paying attention because you're gonna like then tell me how to do it, right?
mm,
And like it just, after doing that for like, I don't know, like 20 times in a month, your first month, you start really getting it. And the cool
yeah,
thing too is that like, you get pushback. It's like, wait a minute, that's not how that works. Remember we talked about that kind of thing? And then you're like, right, 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 right. And it's just again, I think
you're getting
part
those
of
reps in.
exactly, yeah, yeah. It's a practice, and I tell people that all the time. FOIA, being a FOIA analyst, being a FOIA officer, it's a practice. It really is. You learn by doing it. And I had a lot of good people teaching me how to do it.
Do you have any memories of like what a really challenging request was from that time period when you were getting your sea
So
legs and you're like
many.
all the wheels were turning?
There's so many. Because okay,
Mm,
mind you, we were coming in. So I believe I started in earnest. I believe it was about like May or April of 20. I can't remember when my like get in date was. I started off as a contractor. I remember when I became a Fed, right? That was you take your oath of office and everything.
mm.
But yeah, when I came in as a contractor, yeah, you kind of like I guess for me, you kind of like I'm trying to remember, like, okay, it was so much going on. So the pandemic was happening, obviously. That you had everyone in the world, right? Bloomberg, New York Times, Washington Post, yada, all these like things that like to me were like, these like great big institutions, right? That I had like never really conceived of myself like, interacting on the day to day with, asking for, all these documents, asking for status updates, status, blah, 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 related to the pandemic, which is something that, as a FOIA officer, you're also like living through, right? At the same time.
Yeah.
So, there was so many cases where like y- the things that FEMA was producing right at the time was a little bit reactive to like information that they were receiving, right?
Mm.
So sometimes guidance would change very quickly, and like we were having a lot of discussions about like this is new data, this is a new thing we just got, however this like doesn't comport to like this thing that we had put out like 2 weeks ago. Will this cause confusion? And like that was just really difficult. And I remember like sort of being in those discussions with people and like having my managers come into some of those cases that I had and like not taking like the reins and just taking it from me, right? But just being like, okay, this is how you do this, watch, right? And just like it was like Titans fighting, right?
Mm.
Yeah, it was really cool, but there were a lot of cases that were really hard at the beginning. I would say that first like 3 months of being a FOIA officer, as far as like some of the complexity of some of those cases were concerned, that I had like insight into or like I was working on, they genuinely were like some of the hardest cases that I have seen in my 5 years with the Fed. So
Yeah, and this time period actually kind of maybe takes us back and then leads us back into the bigger question of this conversation, which is FOIA under this administration.
yeah.
Do you see any kind of continuities between that time in the last Trump administration and what you're hearing on the ground or know about how FOIA is changing in the last year?
Yeah, so there's the big difference that I've noticed between like, just past administrations, including Trump one, and the current administration, Trump two, is, even when working under Trump one, I kind of found that, there was a lot, I'm gonna say it, there wasn't a lot of hostility to like, federal employees, right? And also like the like institutions of, the federal agencies. But this administration is definitely like, if it's not, if you don't want to like call it hostile, then yeah, I think you have to, admit that it's at least like combative, right? And like the thing now that's happening is sort of like you're not getting a lot of like external pushback outside the agency, right? Like all this pressure from like, the pandemic and stuff. Obviously like it's the external stuff, right? It's the topic, it's the crisis, right? But
Right.
now, like the crisis from when I was there, right? Because I was there between, January 20th, 2016 to about like June 2026. A crisis, like, is like internal, right?
Hmm.
In that, like, you get like, I was hearing about a lot of crazy stuff. To let you know, and maybe a lot of people don't know this, a lot of FOIA offices are not really staffed by like, straight up FOIA officers. In fact,
Hmm.
when I was at Coast Guard, I call myself a FOIA officer, a FOIA analyst, but I was doing a lot of contracting. But this contract was just so close to, I was literally talking to the GS-15 who ran the contract like every single day, right? And we were like talking about work and everything. So like we were there in that office, right? That's no other way to put it. But being like, on the contract side, we were hearing like, a good example is NLRB, right? We had a FOIA contract out with NLRB, for FOIA specialists, and it just got wiped. Right, like
Hmm.
just canceled, right? And then there was another one, and I can't remember which agency that was, but when you start realizing that you have like maybe like a big FOIA office with like feds, right? It's like 10 feds, right? That's a pretty good staff, like FOIA, 10 to 15 feds, it's a pretty good staff FOIA office. You don't start getting into like, the 20 or like 30 plus FOIA officers in a FOIA office until you start going to like, DOJ, OIP, right?
Hmm.
Um and the thing is kind of like if you get rid of those contractors, right, then your main FOIA officers, like your FOIA, yeah, your chief FOIA officer, their deputy, and then like maybe their two or three, however many analysts, all of a sudden their help is just gone,
Hmm.
right? And then but the workload is still there, and the demand is still there, right? And obviously, people want to know about like the changeovers and things like that the Trump administration is doing. So there's like even more demand now as well. So it is kind of like this double bind that FOIA officers, get caught in. Also, not only that, but then, part of the reason why I left, the federal workforce was because my GS-15 that I just talked about, um, she she got fired.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah.
Wait, and what is exactly a GS-15 again?
Yeah, a GS-15 is it's so it's the GS scale of like federal employee, like normal federal employees. It goes from like 1 to 15, 15 being the highest. It's
Mm.
essentially your pay scale and like your experience level. Above like I think like 12, you can't get you usually or like more often than not, aren't able to actually apply for the job. Even with education, you actually have like experience doing like prerequisites and stuff. So to say GS-15 is like pretty far up there in like the
Yeah.
general scale, right? The people that get like paid more than them or have experience more than them are like usually the senior executives of agencies, which is just, like at that point we're like really, really up there.
Yeah.
So she was a chief FOIA officer, right? And yeah, she got fired. And it was in the middle of all these other like things that were going on. Again, the NLRB FOIA contract getting like cut, and then a few other ones that I was hearing about. So I was kind of in my own way. I was like, I have to, make sure I'm floating. I don't know what's going to happen with us. So I thought it was a good time.
And to like own in on that, for example, the NLRB contract,
Yeah.
what happens for them when they don't have that FOIA contract? How do they respond to requests?
They still have to, right? It's just it depends on the agency, right? Sometimes agencies say, you kind of saw some of like similar like positioning during like government shutdowns, right? During government shutdowns, and you might get like an automatic reply telling you that, hey, the shutdown's happening, there's only so many people here, please be patient with us, we're trying, right? But with like when a contract goes and gets gone, right? That doesn't happen. Like the agency won't put out a bulletin saying like, hey, we're understaffed, right? So they'll just kind of quietly keep doing like the work that they can, but then the backlog goes up, right?
Mm.
Or on the other hand, I've seen, where some agencies have started to do this thing where they're trying to like close out as much as their backlog pursuant to like, are you still interested, like letters, right? Or they'll say like something, and I can't remember which agency did this, but I saw like I thought it was like a federal records notice about it. Like, oh, it was DHS. Some agencies will actually start to like mess around with like what they are capable of accepting as FOIA requests and not, to try to like get like, like the amount of FOIA requests coming in to come down to like, in my
Mm.
opinion, kind of sort of artificially like make
Kind
the
of judge the
backlog.
numbers a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. And DHS actually just, came out and published in the Federal Records Notice that they're not taking requests by email anymore, right?
Hmm.
Which for when I was, in the business, like I couldn't really imagine that. Like I feel like if I brought that up, with like my folks, they would have just like been like, ha, okay, moving on, right? But it seems that now, it is what it is.
So they still have to respond to requests. They just have
Yeah.
much less resources to do so. What happens then if, say, you file a lawsuit and a court compels them to produce documents? How do they produce documents?
Well, then
And,
most of the time at that point, the matter is outside of the FOIA office. In my experience, once a case goes into litigation and a
mm,
court says like, hey, like we need this production like now, that's legal at that point. Like, most, I'm not even most, I think like almost all agencies have like a legal office, right? At Coast Guard we called it LGL. And yeah, well, what'll happen is that as soon as there's like, the case gets brought up in court, and an AUSA is assigned to it. AUSA stands for Attorney of the United States of America.
mm,
As soon as an AUSA is assigned to it, yeah, they'll come in, they'll talk to the FOIA officer, say, hey, are these the files? Blah blah blah. The FOIA officer usually say like yes, or they'll say no, but here's a caveat, give some explainer. They'll hand over whatever the product is, right, to them, and then if the AUSA needs anything else, like some kind of supplementary information or something like that. They might come back to the FOIA officer, yeah, who like was working on it, but most of the time, they'll take it, and at that point, it's kind of outside, or not only in the realm of the FOIA office.
Got it. Got it. And then in a similar scenario, you said your boss of bosses,
Mhm.
was fired. What happens then in your office after that? Or what happens in an office when your chief FOIA officer is not there? That person you would go to probably for the biggest, most complicated questions or kind of
Right.
the general structure of everything.
So I won't speak on behalf of, the other people and their experiences, right? I'll speak on my own behalf and what happened with what I was seeing. When my GS15 was fired, and I will say this, the person who like replaced that person, my GS15, he's a great guy too. I think he still might be the FOIA officer for the United States Coast Guard. And he walked into, that situation. But from when I was there, when I met him, he was going to do really good and try to do really good for like, the agency. With that being said, for in the interim, right, I had about 2 weeks essentially before I left where my boss was fired and then, my end date was coming. And as far as like the work that, I was working on, related to her or something like that, or some of the projects that we were talking about, just kind of put them on hold, right? You kind of have to like wait until, whoever's taking like the reins at that point, finds time, in all of their like onboarding and stuff, after all of that, to then, talk to you or bring it up to you and say, hey, this is going on. Or the other way around, if you're, there was like some things, right, where I was like, hey, we actually got to talk about this like right now. And, he was like, yeah, well, this is what's going on, blah, blah, blah. So like, you don't really like it doesn't nothing like falls off like the planet, right? But like with any kind of administration of like an office, things can definitely like fall through the cracks in that moment, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it kind of it's a little chaotic, right? It's not like like everyone's hair is on fire, but it's tense for sure. And then everyone's trying to figure out like for themselves and their own like portfolios and projects like, okay, what do I do with some of these that, required that person's input?
And were you also hearing through the grapevine of this happening at other offices at the time? Because I imagine that's the other thing for morale is like it happens that your GS15 is fired and you're seeing all this change happening, hearing about it, and
Right.
then the pressure starts to heat up a little bit more.
Yeah, and the worst part is that it's, you're not, I'm sure that my GS15 at the time was, maybe paying attention a bit more to like, the other her peers, right? But as far as people like me were concerned, who were like, far a bit down the foot totem pole, we weren't really hearing that because the real noise was coming from entire like departments being gutted. I mean, I remember when I was in the service, when Department of Education, got cut the way it got cut. And like, I was at the Coast Guard, right? So it's a DoD, like it's a DoD agency with like, some adjacent like duties to DHS. But with that being said, we were kind of like, we're probably safe. We're probably not Department of Ed, right? But at the same time, like you just do not know, right? Like
Mm.
you have no idea like when the other shoe's going to drop because if you do see that, an administration has the capacity to cut broadly, right? Like, like out an entire department with like a secretary or a cabinet position, then you're sort of like left wondering like, okay, then I'm obviously like, available or as a target.
Yeah. Yeah. And with all this in mind, what would then a FOIA requester have to expect? Because, like you said, if a whole department gets cut, then it's also not just, the people responding to FOIA requests,
Right.
but it's also the subject matter experts. So then you have the other problem, which is even if the FOIA request comes in, the person there who knows about the thing may not be there anymore,
Right. Right.
on the other side.
Well, to requesters, I think it's important to say this particular bit. Keep on your beat. Do not stop. Do not forget about your FOIA requests. If you use a site like Muckrock, which is great, it will not forget for you. And it will, send reminders and things like that. It might take time for you to get responses back, but I just want to remind people, right? Like, the FOIA is a statute. The FOIA is a law. The FOIA has teeth. The FOIA can make it so that a judge says, hey, agency, hand me these records now. And that is, when you're on the inside and you get that to happen, right? It is so jarring. And it really puts you at attention. And not only for like, someone like me who is like further down the totem pole, but like, someone who is like a GS-15 or an SES, right?
Mm.
When you get a judge's order, you get a judge's order. Like that's the end of it, right? You could appeal and stuff, but most of the time, like most agencies will just say like, "Oh, okay, they found for that. I'm gonna just I want to get over it," right? Like, so yeah, I think what I have to say to requesters is that like, like just because, this is a really tumultuous time within the government and within FOIA offices and the like, doesn't mean that you lose your tools, right? The law is still there, the mechanisms that enforce the law are still there, and the judicial review is definitely still there. Appeals are still there. It might take more time to work out some of your administrative remedies, right? But that doesn't mean that the law's gone, right?
And so it's more maybe about changing your expectations, I guess, and staying on the same path than completely new tactics, if that's
That's
what
right.
you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. I would also say too that for requesters, there's a couple of things that are actually really powerful that some people don't know about, and I think it's worth mentioning. Congressional inquiries, right? If you're in the United States and you have a congressman, a representative, or a senator, and you have a FOIA request out there that has been taking, a bit too long to get an answer for, and you haven't received an acknowledgement, or the agency is like saying that, hey, we'll get this response to you in 3 months, and then 3 months comes, and then, they still don't get it, right? You can feel free, right, to go to your representative or your senator and say, hey, I have this thing with this agency out there, right? These are communications that I have gotten. This is what I have not gotten. Can you help me out? And, I when I get a congressional inquiry for a FOIA case, or in an office, right? If an office gets a congressional inquiry for a FOIA case, it stands people up very quickly. Like I mean, like really, really quickly, because the executive branch does not like the executive branch is a co-equal branch with with Congress, right? But if they can help not getting the Congress involved, they will usually take that route pretty quickly. So that's a good way to go. That's one way to go about it. Also, keep in mind, First Amendment law clinics are really powerful, and they're good sources as well. Furthermore, the National Freedom of Information Council is also fantastic, and they have branches and chapters throughout the country. So look on their website at nfoic.org or .com, or just Google NFOIC.
That's awesome. In the realm of tips and just kind of other ideas that you want to pass on to FOIA requesters, could you go through some of your like greatest hits of what you feel like you learned as an analyst and requesters should know? Meanwhile, I will try
Yeah.
to figure out what's happening with the Q&A because I do not think it's where it should be. And I will see if I can turn that on so folks can ask questions in a second.
Sounds good. So some things that I think are just really good tips for you to actually get your FOIA requests, in the door, start processing, and not get like, any hangups in that process. Number one, the language any and all in any of your requests should not be included there. You will likely get a broad scope determination, your request placed on hold, and then ultimately administratively closed if you don't keep up with it, right? So the wording any and all such and such request or documentation probably should leave your vocabulary. Very straightforward. Another thing is when it comes to, FOIA offices usually have a lot of exposure to the Privacy Act as well. So if you're looking for information related to particular individuals or people, you're going to want to essentially like to ask yourself, does this person that I'm asking for information for, as far as like their name or whatever, does this person have a diminished right to privacy? When I say that, I mean, are they in a senior government leadership position, right? Where they are genuinely accountable to like the Congress, and their business is accountable to like the people of the United States. If they're like an SES or something, right? Then likely you're not going to get a lot of pushback from the Privacy Act. And you'll be able to like get whatever you're looking for. Let's say for example you're looking for like um, the SF-50s for let's say like RFK, right? That's something you likely can probably get if they're around. without like getting your request placed on hold. But if you start asking for like Nicholas Santos's SF50 from FEMA, right? The first thing that FEMA's going to do is say like, hey, we need you to get Nicholas Santos's permission directly, say it to us in a statement of perjury, saying that he is allowing you by name to access his private information. And then that's obviously a difficult hurdle to pass. So if you're looking for private individuals and their type of information, just know that an office is likely going to give you a Privacy Act like notice, and then it's going to be more difficult for you to get that documentation. Sometimes it's best just to not ask for like if you're looking for a particular person's like information or name if they're in the government, it's best to not like say that like their name per se. Sometimes it's best to like, say something along the lines of like the office that they work in, or, like maybe like the emails of a particular department or something like that, just to get around the Privacy Act stuff. And then other tips. This is not so much a tip, but just like more of like, like, hey, like signposting, remember this. Um, the people that you're working with are people, right? A lot of FOIA officers, as far as I've like seen them, they are extraordinarily kind, intelligent, and sometimes like frustrated people with like, how things like go, right? Just as many frustrations that, requesters have about the FOIA officers have the same amount of frustrations about requesters on the FOIA, right? So, keep in mind that, pe these are people that like live their lives, have families, have children, have things outside of work that they need to attend to as well. So sometimes, there was a really good story that I heard one time during like a webinar, I think, during a couple years ago during Sunshine Week. And we had this, I believe it was I believe it was a journalist who came on and he basically said, I was looking for records from this particular agency. I got on the phone with the FOIA officer, and the FOIA officer was just incensed and just really upset. And just, like started like acting very like rudely and, sort of just hung up the phone. The journalists thought to themselves for a moment, like, okay, because after that kind of thing, you're a little shaken up. And, they thought to themselves, like, okay, let me just like wait a beat, right? I'm gonna like, obviously this person is something's going on. I don't know what, if it's just them or if something's actually going on. And turned out, right, he reached out like a couple days later via email. The FOIA officer emailed back and said, hey, I'm really sorry about that. We were actually under an evacuation order. I live in Florida. There was a hurricane coming through, and I was trying to get my family and my kids and everything coming in, and the last thing I wanted to think about, right, was a FOIA request. But now that blah 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 blah, I do have it in mind. We're going to give you the production of the records, but just please be patient and give me a moment, right? And the journalists ended up getting their records, right? And this is just a quick story to just humanize your officer, right? They're a person too.
Totally. I think that is a good place to jump in with some questions. So anyone who has questions, the Q&A is open. I found it. It's working. So is the chat. You can place questions in either places. While we wait for those to come in, I'll just jump in with another kind of big picture question. So based on this conversation, Nick, kind of tracking your journey through FOIA, your experiences, and then where we are now, like how would you answer the question? What the heck is going on with FOIA right now? Because we get asked that so often, like what's the few sentence summary that people need to remember, or you would categorize things, in all
Yeah.
your experience.
So I think okay. I want to preface this by saying that this is my opinion. I do not speak for the federal government. I do not speak for any of the contracting companies that I have worked with, nor any of the agencies that I've worked with. Um, it's what's going on, frankly, is this administration believes in a particular type of paradigm of governance that's called the unitary executive theory. What the theory essentially says is that the executive has full and broad discretion of what to do when it comes to everything that the Constitution and Congress delegates under them under Article 2 of the Constitution. With this theory, this essentially allows, or at least the thought is that it allows the executive branch and the executive per se to like act out in every part that they have jurisdiction over, right? Or like oversight over. So it's something as small as a FOIA request and something as big as like, DOJ policy, is at a sort of like the willful discretion of the executive. They'll say like bound by the law, right? But like, this administration's a little interesting when it comes to its relation to the law. So the way that that's affecting the FOIA right now is that you start having like this executive discretion. For the biggest way it's coming out is like through its like contracts, right? So the fact that it's it was looking at all of the contracts that it had within the federal government, looking for like fraud, waste, and abuse, and or like like DEI initiatives to cut um, is the first thing that that affected like the workforce and especially the FOIA office workforce. The next thing tends to be like you just get like weird policy stuff. You start getting like really concerned with like if I make this release to like like the New York Times or like this other like institution that is like sort of at odds with like the administration, or if I'm doing this work, do I have exposure to like like my like bosses like sort of like being upset with me, right? Um,
Because it's this unitary idea of how things are done, the
exactly.
unitary executive theory, as Melinda was asking what the exact name was,
Yeah.
um, and not all that institutional knowledge that you learned on your first day in FEMA,
Right.
that
Exactly.
matters in that moment.
Exactly. And like this is not to say that, I have seen like the executive like come down all the way from like for like for a FOIA request. But this is just sort of to say like, this is like the general attitude that the administration seems to have. And it's pushing up on a lot of different things that have kind of been like sort of like taken for granted within like the administration of federal government. And it leads to a lot of weird and wacky stuff. One thing that it's really led to is like that the really difficult like for all those FOIA requests that went to Doge, but actually like Doge was like, funny enough, we're not an agency that could be FOIA'd. We're completely exempt. And then I think Crew took them to court, and Crew like for basically forced them to like like say what they were saying, but then they were backtracking, right? And so like the important thing here, right, when it comes to like unitary executive theory is that it is a theory, right, and it has to fundamentally at some point impact onto like material conditions. Material conditions being court, being the facts, being like, the records, yada, yada, yada. And like courts express their power through their presence and through their like verdicts. And the presence here is really important because like just the fact that Crew brought them to court, right, made them change their position, right?
Mm.
Suddenly they went from like, hey, we're completely exempt from the FOIA, right, blah, 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 to like, okay, it's not so much that we're exempt from the FOIA, it's more that like the request wasn't routed properly and that kind of stuff. So then suddenly it's like, okay, where did that argument go? Right. But that's the thing. When that theory or the argument encounters like material conditions, like it starts to really betray kind of just how weak it is.
Mm. And I guess maybe one thing requesters could take from that is that presence,
Yeah.
still matters. That
Yeah.
this law still matters in your presence, counterweighting that unitary executive theory when it's pushing down on the actual values and culture and law that FOIA formed,
Yeah.
is a weight of some sort.
Yeah, yeah, completely. And like, I want to just bring this up really quickly. I talked about the change for the DHS policy and the Federal Records Notice when it put out saying that we're not going to accept email requests anymore. Um, Federal Records Notices, right? They enjoin actions for agencies, but at the same time, before those policy positions are like affirmed, right, by being published in the Federal Records Notice, there's a commentary period, right? There's a whole time when the agency is like, hey, we're putting this out. Anyone who's interested in talking about it, please send us some commentary, right? That is a great avenue to be able to push back on some of it and materially and say like, hey, I know you're doing this policy. That's terrible, actually. And if enough people do that, right, it gets a lot of attention. And then the agency starts becoming a little bit more trepidatious when it comes to actually implementing the policy or publishing it later on.
Hmm.
This is not the first time that this happens with federal records notices. This is not a theory. This is like something that happens kind of commonly too. So, there's avenues, right, to push back, not just courts.
Yeah, and I guess in that sense, could a requester do that with the agency that they request most from, not in the sense of giving public comment, but like trying to understand a little bit more what's going on at that agency, whether it's a big agency or a small agency, how many people they actually have there now, and trying to both through their requests and, through whatever other means, remind them that even with the amount of officers they have, there are still people requesting.
Yeah, and the way to do that is like, okay, agencies are they respond very well to bad backlogs, right?
Mm,
Keep requesting. Do not stop requesting. If they tell you, hey, you can't request this way, don't stop your volume of requests. Keep it going, right?
mm,
And like I think the reason I say this is because I feel like some people that, I've maybe some of my previous management I might not be like a very happy with that statement. But the reason I'm saying this is because like, if people get like if requesters get like punished over and over and over again through like federal policy or just like not respond like non-responsiveness to requests, then people get frustrated. When people get frustrated, some of them crash out of the procedure, right? And then they stop requesting, right? And then over time, if people stop requesting, yada yada, there is space to make the argument of like, is this even necessary anymore? And
mm,
when I say that, this is coming from a place where like there is a I from the there is talk out there of like, does the FOIA need reform? Does the FOIA need to be like, completely like, tossed away and thrown in the trash and like tried something else, right? Like keep the FOIA alive. It's what we have, and I think that, keeping the request pressure and like being dogged in your, pursuit of the truth and or your beat or your records, is gonna say it's gonna make its presence known just on its own, right? One FOIA request is a pebble in the bucket of a backlog, but backlogs are important, and backlogs, bigger backlogs, get agencies to hire more FOIA officers, more analysts,
mm.
and all that stuff. So, agencies might not like big backlogs because it forces them to like think about like, hey, how do we need to like change to meet the moment? And sometimes the change to meet the moment is, like get more people, man.
Yeah, and I think that might be counterintuitive for some journalists because they might feel like, well, if I'm not going to get a response in the time that I would want to for my reporting,
Yeah,
I should just, they have X amount less people in that department or responding to requests now. I'm setting my expectations in the way that like I won't get that record, so I might as well not ask for it.
yeah,
But what you're saying is the opposite, is like if you want that in the long term,
yeah,
even if it's not going to come right now, keeping the pressure on the agency will actually get us out on the other side of this, maybe in
yeah.
a better place.
Yeah, because eventually what ends up happening is that the agency says, "Hey, look, I'm tired of this backlog, right? I have the agency head or the secretary, whoever you want to call them, right? They'll say, I'm tired of this backlog. Your SES is, I'm tired of the backlog. I have other things to worry about. I have like, congressional members asking me to, join like a Zoom meeting related to like the backlog and why it is the way it is. They'll go to the FOIA officer or the chief FOIA officer and say, what do we need to do, right? And sometimes the chief FOIA officer, can say like, we just need more people, right? We genuinely need more people. We could do like systemic change in the agency for how FOIA goes, but a lot of times, like, kind of need more people. And yeah, that's my take on it. I think other people might disagree. I feel like that's like it's a rambunctious take for sure, but it's mine.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. And what I like about it is it kind of, the way I wanted to wrap up this conversation is think about like what does this look on like on the other side? Because right now, so many institutions are being destructed
Right.
in our federal government. And it's hard to imagine what they will be next 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, how long it will take to reconstruct the different institutions that were broken.
Yep.
And so I think this is a good place to start rounding out that question because it actually it looks forward to that and kind of yeah, like I said, kind of in a counterintuitive way that actually when it seems like there's less people to respond to FOIA requests, there's less resources, you're going to get your requests slower. Actually, the best thing is to keep the pressure on and think about what would it like if eventually this office had enough people to respond to these requests and that they knew that people were still knocking at the door every day.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, it's exactly right. Demand is still there. How are they going to like ignore it? You know what I mean? And also like, do this is a bit of like a tangent, not too much of a tangent, but I think it's important. This is something I just want to say. Agencies respond really well to litigation. When I say really well, I mean they actually respond, right? Um, so like if FOIA is a piece of the law that like most people don't want to get into litigation for. It's a lot of work. It's impractical, yada yada yada. I encourage you, right? Like get familiar with like the law, get familiar with some cases. You don't have to be like exhaustive, right? right? But if you're passionate about this, like I genuinely encourage you, like maybe try to go a little pro se with it, right? Like maybe just try to show up to court just to show that to to the agency, like, hey, I'm gonna show up. Right? Like you're not gonna get rid of me just by like, insisting that I don't have a voice, right? I don't know what I might not know exactly like how this thing works, but at the very least, like I'm gonna let you know, like I know that you're accountable to something, and the
Mm.
accountability tends to be the courts.
And question just came in from Melinda, who asked, "What is the best way to approach redactions, especially
Uh,
seemingly unjustified redactions?" Thank
yes,
you, Melinda, for this very concrete question.
I love that question, Melinda. The first thing I would do is go to Muckrock, or sorry, Document Cloud, and use the bad redactions tool and see if
Mm.
they're actually good redactions. But if you find that they're actually all good redactions and they're supposed to be redacted, so it depends on agencies. I'm going to talk about federal here for like a moment. State, you start getting like really, it starts getting really murky very quickly. But for the federal agencies, usually what you can do is that you can actually like, talk to your FOIA officer, and most of the time when they redact something, it's because they have to do it or they're going to get punished at work. Like that's kind of like it's a big deal, right? There are times as a FOIA officer where you're sort of like, this information is really important. Like this is really important information, but you have to balance that, right, with disclosure versus like withholding. That's the entire job, right? That's like the entire thing. And you can't have a spill of important information, right? Because that's like your duty as a FOIA officer is to,
Mhm.
to keep that, and maintain it. So when it comes to like redactions that you're just like, oh, this isn't right, right, like whole page redactions, like the entire page is just redacted. Use your resources, right? Use your administrative appeal rights, talk to the FOIA officer, insist if you can have a phone call regarding like some of the information. If the FOIA officer's not willing to talk, get in touch with the FOIA public liaison. At the FOIA public liaison, you're not getting anywhere there, maybe go to OGIS, right? Go to your congressman and say like, hey, look at this thing, right? Just a blank piece of paper, right? And ask your congressman to like, maybe put in a congressional inquiry asking like, hey, why was this redacted that way? Use the levers that you got. There's a lot of levers, right? Are they all like, going to be like silver bullets? No, no. But at the same time though, like, there's not silver bullets in real life. That doesn't mean you're not going to use bullets. You know what I mean? But yeah, so like, get familiar with like the administrative like, remedies you have available to you. See if you can use them, and exhaust them, literally, like exhaust them as much as you can, especially when it comes to redactions. I think that's what I have to say there. If I answered your question correctly, Melinda.
Yeah, and I feel like I see a lot of, speaking of the one black block of
Yeah,
redactions on a page, I feel like I see a lot at both at the local level and sometimes at the federal level of redactions for huge swaths of text without the clear exemptions that that would fit under. And I think one of the first things that I do when I look at redactions is like make sure each redaction is segregated in a way that I know what exemption is cited for that redaction,
yeah,
and that it's if they're saying that this large block of text is all one type of exemption or one exemption, that's clear to me in the structure of the documents that I asked for. Like if I ask for
yeah,
100 pages of documents and there's just lots of redacted text, and then they say, in their response that it was all one exemption, that would be confusing to me because it's a big document with lots of different types of information. So I wouldn't expect that same information to be the same type of exemption over and over again.
right.
But often, and you will see that exemptions that have with the exemption, or sorry, redaction with the exemption cited on the redaction or next to the redaction, so you can clearly know that's what this relates to. Uh,
Right. And you bring up a good point. Now that I'm thinking about the answer, my answer a little bit more, I was coming at it from like sort of a like, perfect world scenario where like the person doing the redactions is doing the right thing most of the time. Being here at Muckrock and like now being exposed to all the lovely, lovely practices of every FOIA officer in the country. Yeah, that's not entirely like, it's not reasonable to expect that every single officer is going to redact like, as well as they should all the time. With that being said, though, I want to point out a couple of redactions that are just like very difficult to overcome, right? And then the rest of the redactions that you might see, feel free to try to challenge them, right? They're a little bit weaker. So number one, B6 is difficult to overcome, and B7C is difficult to overcome. These are like the privacy redactions. One B6 is just for like normal privacy stuff. The second one, B7C, is for like law enforcement specific stuff. You're likely not going to get above that. B5 is like the next strongest of like all of the bunch, I would say. At least the ones that get used like often. B5 is pretty difficult to overcome, but at the same time, like it's come under a lot of controversy lately, and courts are starting to look at it a little bit with like a skeptical eye. So if you want to challenge that in an appeal or whatever, that's probably a good place to start. If you see like a whole page blacked out for B5, that is your cue to go into the appeal. Like you should do it for sure. And then the other redactions, except for the B7 series, the rest of them, like look into them, right? B1 super hard to overcome because it's national security stuff. If an agency comes out and says like I'm redacting this pursuant to B2, B2 hasn't been used that way in like decade, if not more.
Hmm.
So fight them on that. Yeah. There's like not all redactions are like built the same, right? Not all of them are as strong as each other. There's some weaknesses here. Get familiar with the weaknesses. And if you have any questions about it, let me know.
And Melinda had asked specifically about security risks, but then said that you might have just answered that. Do you have anything more related to security? I think Melinda meant national security rather than like
Yes,
privacy, which I think
correct.
both are pretty common in terms of redactions.
Yeah, so B1, I've never had the opportunity to use B1, mostly because the subject matter and information that I worked with didn't require like national security documentation or anything. But it's really hard, right? Like to even get like that reviewed, like national security information, you have someone the person who's reviewing it, probably needs to have a clearance, right? And then if you're going to take it to litigation later down the line, your attorney might need to have a clearance, right? Or it gets really murky. So if you see a B1, unfortunately, that's pretty rough. You might have get to be able to get something out of it, right? Especially if the agency's playing like hard and loose. But most agencies that use B1, most of the time they're not playing hard and loose. Most of the time they're very serious about it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
We're approaching time. Does anyone have any questions to round us out? Drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. Gonna mark some questions done from Melinda. I'll give everyone a couple seconds while I pull up our full suite of Sunshine Week events, and that's what I will leave you all with. All right. Nick is a great person to ask questions to. Maybe we'll have him back and you guys can ask more questions. I just want to say I dropped the link in the chat. That is a full listing of all the fun things we have going on for Sunshine Week. We had a great call yesterday about investigating fraud with Walter Smith Randolph. We have the special edition FOIA Friday today. We have the actual Sunshine Fest in DC. We have a webinar on banned books next Wednesday, March 18th. And then on March 19th, we have a webinar on starting small and building a small newsroom people trust. So a lot of fun stuff going on, and we hope to see you around there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.